Thank you very much for a generous introduction. I realize the main topic before you today is on cyber threats, and that will be a lot of the discussion which will follow what I have to say. I am exposed to a lot of the cyber world. I'm interacting with a number of things there. My home where I grew up is near Augusta, Georgia, which is now the home of Army Cyber Command, and the state of South Carolina has a major initiative dealing with the cyber threats that involves the private sector as well as our universities, as everybody is trying to come up to speed on the issue. But the main thing I want to discuss with you today is the broader threat, and in particular the threat to the electric power grid of North America, upon which our very viability rests. And unfortunately, at least in the States, I can say to you that it is fragile. And you described a situation where a branch falling in Ohio could knock out the entire northeastern grid here. And I'm not sure how far south it went. I know New York was engaged in that world. I will be talking about nuclear power, which is, in my mind, I'm an advocate of nuclear power so that you don't misunderstand what I have to say. But nuclear our plants present a bit of a hazard in their current form if the grid is lost and they shut down, which they do by directive, at least in the United States. And Brian tells me it's a similar situation according to regulations here in Canada. Then the problem becomes restarting the reactors, which takes a fair amount of energy in and of itself. And in particular, the cooling water becomes a problem. I assume this organization and the people here are familiar with Fukushima and the events in Japan and those problems which were created by the lack of cooling water fundamentally. So having the means of restarting the power plants is a really critical, important factor. I believe you folk here in Canada have, by the nature of your infrastructure, a leg up on dealing with that problem that we don't have in South Carolina and in the United States. And I believe there's means for cooperation. So that's the main thing I want to chat with you about. I'll deal with some other issues as well. There are a couple of handouts outside you might pick up. One is an article Peter Pry and I wrote, and we're sandwiching the conference between us. It's entitled The Threat to Melt the Electric Grid. And it really keys off of Admiral William Gortney's public announcements a year ago, a little over a year ago now, about moving back into Cheyenne Mountain out in Colorado Springs, which is a joint U.S.-Canadian command, as I assume folks in this room know. And they're doing that and hardening the equipment there, having moved out a decade ago because Cold War is over and we can relax our preparations and preparedness and so on. So that system is being hardened again inside of Cheyenne Mountain at the expense of something on the order of $1 billion US. That's as it should be. That is a command which is responsible for warning of threats that come at us from over the North Pole, ballistic missile threats primarily, the issues that throughout the Cold War were of great concern. And we need to make sure that the communication systems and the warning systems, including places here in Canada, are wired in properly and can keep the president informed to deal with such a threat were it to occur. Regrettably, we have not done that kind of preparation looking to the south, which is where many threats can come from today, and I'll be chatting with you about that issue as well. But the reason I focused on passing this out to you is that, to be sure, Admiral Gortney is recognizing a real problem, taking clear initiatives to deal with the issue. When it comes to this Cold War mission, which he continues to have today, or actually his successor does now, He has recently relinquished command to, I forget the lady's name, but anyway, a new commander at NORAD. But he's not doing anything, was not doing anything, and that command is not doing anything to protect the civil infrastructure of the United States against these same threats. The threats are just as real to them as they are to our warning and communication systems on the military side, and we know how to fix them just as we know how to fix them on the military side, but we, alas, are not doing anything to deal with that problem. And in fact, our legislators are blocking the way. It has been a major problem in the United States to get the political stars aligned to deal with this issue. Peter will be talking later about a group called the EMP Commission, which has been reestablished, and we're having to fight with the DOD every step of the way to get that up and going and have resources in order for them to come back. They're important because until 8 years ago, most of the information, key information on what to do about the EMP threat was highly classified. And so it wasn't available for people to use. That changed with the publication of that report, but we still have a problem in that people don't recognize a threat. And the reason why I want to spend time today talking with you about it is really a consequence of that ignorance, primarily. Maybe you folks are better informed here in Canada than in the United States. We find when we talk to the local people in the United States, it's very easy for them to get the message, and they're extremely and extraordinarily frustrated that their representatives in Washington are doing nothing about the problem. So there are major state initiatives going on in the U.S. To begin to address this problem, and I'll talk a little bit about that. The Missile Defense Front is a particular interest of mine, and there's another paper that's outside as well, which is a letter signed by not quite all, but most of the previous directors of what's now called the Missile Defense Agency. It's the legacy of Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, which I was privileged to lead as well at one stage. And we're arguing there that we need to redress some of the mistakes that have been made over the past couple of decades in building our missile defense systems, which are no longer responsive to the growing threat of ballistic missile attack. They are inherently not affordable to take account of the proliferating threat we now are confronting. And so there's a letter that we wrote to the authorizers in Washington, both in the House and Senate, the leadership, basically saying that some of the constraints that were put on our systems 2 decades ago should be modified now to deal with today's reality, and I'll come back to that issue. Can I have the next chart? That was a sort of a lengthy introduction of all the issues I want to cover. I'm not going to read the charts to you. They will be available on the webpage here, and I gather this is being recorded so you can follow them if you can't see them very well then. The point of this picture, though, is just to show that the interconnectedness, if you will, of the electric grid of North America, and particularly the various power lines that are involved. It's the lifeline, at least in the States and maybe to a lesser degree in Canada, for basically today's economic system, which is a just-in-time economy, basically. I don't know how it works here, but when we have hurricanes and that sort of thing in the United States, you get a week's worth of stuff, maybe 3 days more likely, in the grocery store before the food is gone. And that's just the nature of what we've become used to. You lose electricity, you lose transportation, you lose communication, you lose banking, you lose a whole host of things that we take it for granted today. We have shared benefits of the grid with Canada and shared problems, as we talked earlier. When your grid goes down, some of ours goes down as well. And as I will discuss, there are aspects of your infrastructure which I believe is valuable not only to you, but also to us. Next chart. This is just a picture I was able to get off of the web to make a point. I don't think it is accurate in the details today. Brian showed me some of the new information which would suggest a different, but the blue in the chart is water, hydroelectric power, and Canada is the lower right. The United States is up top. Not as much hydroelectric power there as you can see, and worldwide is up on the left-hand side. This shows more coal-generated power, I believe, than exists today in Canada from talking to Brian. It is still a major resource in the United States, as you can see. And the reason for making these distinctions, when you think of the resiliency of the grid, whether you're speaking of cyber threats or physical threats or EMP, the hydroelectric power, I believe, is the most resilient source of energy. Next to that is coal. And the least effective among these is the natural gas. And that's because the natural gas lines are heavily dependent upon solid-state electronics, little SCADAs, the little tiny computers. And that's a problem both from the perspective of cyber attack and from the point of view of EMP attack. So what we're doing with our political world today, this is a message I want to give you, is that we're retiring the more resilient sources of energy and replacing them with less resilient sources of energy. That's more important perhaps in the United States than here in Canada because of your heavy investment in hydroelectric power. The problem, of course, in addition to the power sources is the interconnectedness that is required through the circuits to transmit the power, step up and step down transformers and that sort of thing, which are critical elements, and if they aren't hardened, they can be lost. And in the case of the extra high voltage transformers, we don't build them in this part of the world anymore. They're built in Germany and South Korea, I believe it is. They take on the order of a year to build each one. And so if you lose those particular transformers and you don't happen to have the right one stockpiled, and as I understand it, each of the key substations has its own particular signature that goes with this. This is a serious challenge. So there's an importance, in addition to the source, of being sure that the grid itself is protected against the kinds of threats that I'm talking about. How many of you are familiar with the Aurora experiment that was run at in Idaho National Laboratories, I believe, about 5, 6, 7 years ago? But that's an example of what cyber can do. It was purely done as an experiment, but it really caused the destruction of the generators of a nuclear plant. Basically, hackers doing that. And I happen to know the individual who performed that experiment, and he tells me that we have not really taken care of that vulnerability. So cyber can create major problems of these energy sources as well, particularly in the nuclear plants. Next chart. I put this chart up to just point out the various threats. You've read Lights Out, Ted Koppel's book. If you haven't, I would strongly encourage you to read it. Do you know who Ted Koppel is, this group? He, for many years, was the whatever you call it.
Nightline.
Nightline was the guy. He was the principal spokesman for it. Is well known in the United States. He is not a political animal. He really is a first-class reporter, and he wrote a book on the cyber threat to the electric grid. And it's since this is your subject, this is one you really ought to read. He is also quite concerned about the other threats to the grid, both physical and EMP attack and so on. On the right-hand side, the solar storms. This is something also you Canadians are familiar with because you've had major grid shutdown associated with solar emissions, major solar emissions. And that is a threat, and that is a threat that's going to happen one day. It's a very low frequency, low amplitude, long duration pulse which creates a surge of energy that focuses then on various substations within the grid, and that's its basic signature for creating problems. And it's going to happen. It's estimated by, and I don't know how we make these estimates, something on the order of 150-year period is when you can expect them to happen. The last major one was in 1859, and it burned the telegraph cable, which was then deployed under the Atlantic between the U.S. and Canada and Europe. So today, with modern electronics, it would be a much bigger problem. On the left-hand side is a newspaper from Hawaii, 1962, when a test was conducted in the South Pacific, some 900 miles away, which caused the lights to go out in Hawaii, created various levels of damage there. I was at Bell Labs at the time. It shut down the then beginning satellite systems that we were deploying. See, I think I listed up here how many it was, but several were immediately, it's in the next chart, but immediately lost, and then shortly thereafter, within the next couple of weeks, a couple of dozen of our low altitude satellites were lost because of that high altitude burst. It woke us up in the United States, and many of us then spent the next better part of a half century making sure that our key military systems were hardened to deal with that issue, and it became a very highly classified matter, as I mentioned earlier, until the middle of the last decade. Across the bottom is the Metcalf. Are you familiar with the Metcalf attack, physical attack outside of San Diego in California? Most of us who've looked at that believe that it really was by special forces type people. Could have been a dry run for later. And they missed by cutting one cable, bringing down all of Silicon Valley at this one place where it was attacked. John Wellinghoff, who chaired the Federal Energy Reliability Commission in the States, said that there were 9 such stations if you did the careful analysis of the grid, which if they were taken down would cause cascading failures throughout the grid, like the branch that fell in Ohio. It would take the grid down for over a year. So, and if you lose the grid and you lose the electricity, then that becomes an existential threat to the people of the United States. We're no longer an agrarian society there, and we depend almost entirely on our essential life support for things moved in from the outside. Next chart. I've already mentioned this point, and this was that killed 3 satellites immediately, 7 more in the next few months. And today's systems would be much more vulnerable because they're based on the solid state electronics, not vacuum tube electronics of that earlier era. Next chart. This is, I've already mentioned this point. This is the president's airplane. We did various and sundry tests to assure that his aircraft was survivable, as well as other key links to our submarines and bombers and wherever, in case we were attacked. And we tested them. And this was a matter of some considerable rigor. And my whole point in putting the chart up is down at the bottom here. The lesson for today that we learned during the Cold War is that if you don't test it, you don't believe it. Systems, electronic systems, are very complicated. Maintenance can be a problem, and if they're not carefully tested along the way, you can have vulnerabilities that creep in from the maintenance process itself that have to be dealt with. And the electric grid itself is a very complicated and fragile matter, at least in the States. I don't know anything about Canada. But it grew up helter-skelter over the last half century. And so there's a lot of ways that things can go wrong. And my point in dwelling on this is that we're never going to be able to harden everything, and therefore you have to pick some things that you do first. You give priority to, You make sure they're viable, can be reestablished, and you build outward from these islands within the grid itself to reestablish the grid. People don't like to think in these terms, but unless we think in those terms and plan, we're inviting catastrophe in my judgment. Next chart. This is to say there's reason for optimism, at least in the States, for dealing with these issues, but there's a big but. Everything seems to have a precondition of some sort that's slowing things down. I mentioned Koppel's emphasis on cyber, but he also points out the other issues. There's Washington help, like I mentioned already with Admiral Gortney, recognizes a problem and is dealing with it under his military mission, but he's not dealing with it under his Homeland Security mission because the DoD doesn't have that responsibility. And when you look at how things are organized in Washington and you turn to see what the Department of Homeland Security is doing, and I know I'm being taped, but I'm going to say it anyway, that's the most dysfunctional organization in Washington. And they're not doing anything. They're not even including among the scenarios that require various institutions of government to deal with the issue, the class of problems that we're talking about here. And so the Department of Homeland Security, which duly has due responsibilities, they're not dealing with it. The Department of Energy, which has some beginning to work on key issues, but I worry they're going to reinvent the wheel. I've already told you, we understand what the threat is. We know how to fix it. We just need to go do it. And it doesn't cost an arm and a leg either, but the political obstacles are real. Because of those problems, we're now taking a number of initiatives in various states across the United States. I'm going to talk a little bit about South Carolina, what we're doing there in a moment. Peter's very involved in all of these issues as well. And there's some priority efforts that are going on. The EMP Commission's been reestablished, but they don't have the resources. And I said DoD is still stalling a year afterward in getting things restarted. We need a national architecture. We don't have one for dealing with this issue. And frankly, I should be, because of the interconnectedness with Canada, it should include Canada as a joint kind of an architecture as well. Another important one down here is the National Guard, which plays a really important role, I believe, in the United States. And I assume you have companion relationships here in Canada. In the States, because after the Civil War, posse comitatus ground ruled out the involvement of the federal military in operations inside the United States. And the National Guard is where that responsibility now resides, and they belong to the governor unless they're federalized. And I'm sure you understand these relationships. The vice commander in NORAD is a three-star National Guardsman, former adjutant general from the state of Oregon. So getting them up to speed, and I don't know whether Bob Newman's going to talk at all about this issue because it's an area we're very interested in and building the infrastructure to deal with it, I think is key to working this problem in the long run. Next chart. And we're getting the universities in the act. Now I want to talk about the nuclear. In the United States, most of the power plants are the red dots in the right, the Eastern Interconnect. There are three interconnects to the grid within the states. There's the eastern one, which is about east of this, the western one, and then Texas. Texas always does its own thing, you know. And so there is a grid within Texas, which turns out to be pretty useful. There's a state senator there who was at the in Los Angeles working to harden the Minuteman system back in the period I was at the Air Force Weapons Laboratory in the 1960s. So he understands the EMP issue, and he's trying to get the folks in Texas to deal with this across their grid. And we have a major initiative going on down there that I hope will yield products for everybody as time goes along. This is just a typical day showing a wind pattern, and you can imagine what it could be like if you had a meltdown in these reactors and radiation hazards were released into the air. I already told you, they shut down if the grid goes down. Then the problem is how do you restart them? And in particular, how do you make sure the cooling water which cools the spent fuels off into little pools beside the reactors themselves. How that keeps running, given that the diesel fuel will run out generally in each of these locations within weeks at most, if not days. Next shot. This is a nearby state for you, Pennsylvania. They're the second largest producer of electricity by way of nuclear power. First largest is Illinois, which is also not too far from you. And that's my reason for putting it up. And you can see how heavily they are into nuclear. They have a lot of coal power, which for at least now anyway is important because coal plants are more resilient because their circuitry and so on involves the old electrical and mechanical kinds of activities, which has greater inherent hardness. They depend a lot on natural gas as well. And as I've already mentioned, that is a problem area that has to be dealt with. Next chart. South Carolina, I want to mention because that's my home state, and I'm working there in particular inside of Duke Energy. Do you know who Duke Energy is, people here? It's the largest energy company in the United States. And at least a handful of engineers there that I know firsthand are very interested in trying to figure out how to deal with this issue and how their equities can be aligned with support from the local people. And by local, I mean at the county level. I don't know what you call it here, but the local sheriffs, the local emergency managers, and so on, to assure that their equities will be viable in case the grid goes down. And York County involves a nuclear plant and a hydroelectric plant. And the nature of the scheme that we're putting together is to figure out how to use the hydroelectric energy because it will be available. Those generators turn just by the flow of water, as you know. And interconnecting pathways back to the nuclear station, first to restart or assure that the cooling water supplies do not shut down, and then secondly, to begin to restart the reactor itself. I don't know exactly how much energy is required, but it's on the order, I believe, of 30 to 50 megawatts of energy just to restart a nuclear power plant. So it's not a small thing, and you don't restart it unless you've got a load that you can depend on in the grid itself, which means that there has to be a surrounding border region that is viable. And now when I'm talking about this class of problems, I believe I'm talking about both cyber as well as the EMP potential threat and what terrorist problems could be planned. The Duke Energy people that are working with me on this have gotten it approved through the CEO, the front office, so that the lessons learned out of this pilot study that we're doing there, which also includes the Mecklenburg County, where their corporate headquarters is in Charlotte, North Carolina, and Gaston County, where they have a major coal plant, which will also be part of this pilot study. So we're going to try to be running a study which may be interesting to you, of interest to you folk here in Canada. I'm sure it will be of interest in Pennsylvania. I've already met with people there. You mentioned Cindy Ayers, who is, I think, maybe spoken to this group before with the War College, the Army War College, and I've met with them as well to discuss these issues. And then I want to go to Illinois, which is the top reliant state on nuclear power. Next chart. I want to just say a brief word. I don't know whether most of you are too young to remember, but 54 years ago today, Adlai Stevenson made a presentation in the United Nations, challenging Nikita Khrushchev's claim that there were no nuclear weapons in Cuba, and he showed the U-2 photographs and so on. And a couple of days ago, I was at the Student Union in New York City watching all this and got hurried home as quickly as possible to prepare for the duck and cover moment. That was the most dangerous period in the Cold War, in my judgment. And we learned after the Cold War was over that it was even more dangerous than we had thought at the time, because there were already 100 nuclear weapons in Cuba. Khrushchev wanted to keep them. And I'm not Khrushchev, Castro And Khrushchev overruled him. And we didn't know about that interaction until later. We were told these things, which tells you something about how reliable maybe intelligence information is on occasion, in spite of how well prepared we were for that crisis. We didn't understand all of what was going on. But that was a dangerous period. At least in those days, our leaders made known to the people what the threats were so that they could prepare and be involved. I wish I could say the same today, and that's just simply not true today. And one of the threats from the South today has to do, next chart, with this threat of missiles that can be launched off coast. You can buy this kind of launcher, which fits inside of a container ship, from the Russians to launch cruise missiles or ballistic missiles. And so any number of states could have those. You can buy a Scud missile for a few $1 million. They're within the means of terrorists that want to attack us. And if they get their hands on nuclear weapons, they might just as well do this. And the ideas of deterrence and so on, in my judgment, don't work for those scenarios. Those people want to kill as many Americans as they can. Over here is you can't see all the chart, but in 2013, we stopped, not we, but the Panamanians stopped a vessel that was carrying 2 SA-2s, old-fashioned surface-to-air missiles from the Soviet era. In fact, we lost one pilot, a Clemson graduate, by the way, flying a U-2 in the Cuban Missile Crisis to a U-2, non-nuclear, but a U-2, a SA-2 air surface-to-air missile. So this is old technology. You can carry a nuclear weapon up to 40, 50 miles, set it off over the United States, and take out the eastern interconnect of the grid. Next chart. That's real, and we're not doing anything about it. We have no defense against that today. I believe we should be updating our missile defense programs. I have pictures of the Aegis system. Are you familiar with Aegis? You know, it's the destroyers and cruisers that we have deployed around the world. We have a system deployed on about 35 of those ships today. I'm proud of, because I started the program on my watch, and it's, in my judgment, the most cost-effective defense system we have today. We're deploying the components of that in Romania. It's already an operational system and will be in Poland in 2018. I believe we should be putting them on military bases around the Gulf of Mexico. And we need to redo space. I understand that folks here in Canada are concerned about weapons in space and not militarizing space, and this has been a politically challenging issue ever since I was associated with the SDI program. But the most cost-effective system that came out of the first $30 billion investment of the SDI program was shown in the second slide here. It's called a Brilliant Pebble. Far less expensive and more effective than anything we have deployed since. And it was killed. Les Aspin, when he was Secretary of Defense, said he was taking the stars out of Star Wars in whenever it was, 1991, I guess, 92, 93, and terminated that program, dispersed the people who were on top of the technology. The people who know more about this technology today are the Chinese and perhaps the Russians, but certainly the Chinese. And I believe we need to go back to the drawing board and bring that forward. We know that the technology works. If you ever go to the Smithsonian in Washington, you'll see the Clementine satellite there. It's the National Academy of Sciences, as well as NASA, awarded the small team that put that system together to go back to the moon for the first time in a quarter century. And we mapped the surface of the moon in 13 different spectral bands, more data than was taken in all of Apollo. And we used the basic elements, the prototypical components of the Brilliant Pebbles program to do that. So we had the technology 25, 30 years ago to do that job, and it was stopped for political reasons. And that's what's behind this letter that I mentioned earlier. I think that's the main message. If you go to the last chart, it's just the bottom lines. We have credible threats to the grid. We know how to fix them technically. We can afford to fix them. It's not a money problem. It's a political problem. The natural threat's going to happen at some point. I think it's a matter of time because before we're going to get cyber actions against various components of the grid. That's your main subject today, but I don't think you should forget about the most horrific of all the problems, which is the nuclear-related electromagnetic pulse. And as I'm sure Peter will tell you later in more detail, this is part of the doctrine of all of our adversaries today. They don't think about cyber versus this versus that in putting together their military doctrines. They tie all of these things together. So if they come after us with a serious threat, it won't be one or the other. It'll be a combination of all. So we know how to do it. We need to get on with the job. And I think we have to work the problem from the bottom up because, at least in the United States, the federal establishment is broken badly. And I hope you're better off here in Canada. Thank you.